this is where I'm quite optimistic, I suppose, because I do think that, there's so much investment and attention being applied to agentic AI that it will become actually a subsidized technology, right? A bit like Ubers. Where I live, Ubers are super cheap, and pretty much Uber's been paying you, every ride because they're going for that classic scale play. And I think it's a bit like with agentic AI. We're going to have access to a ton of really, really useful tech. And that gives us a chance to build out these value creation engines and these platforms at the heart of an organization. And then we're free to organize using whatever socio-political, socio-technocratic model we want, right? Because we've solved the problem of hierarchy in a sense. If you look at hierarchy having three purposes in an organization, one is status signaling, which it's natural at. Dogs do it, humans do it, even cats do it. Then you've got hierarchy as a communication network, which it's terrible at. It's just about the worst way to communicate. And then you've got hierarchy as a way of holding together these manual processes. Well, the third one we don't need. The second one we've already moved beyond, and we have enough social technology in the organization to communicate effectively. Yeah, sure, people can wear badges and different colored clothes if they want to feel important. Who cares, right? What matters is that we actually do the work. That's where I think agentic AI coming together with the platform philosophy is just the most hopeful moment, I think, in the last 20, 25 years of digital transformation to actually create real 21st century organizational operating systems.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. On this podcast, we explore the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm joined today by my usual co-host, Shruti Prakash. Hello, Shruti.
Hello, everybody.
Our guest for this episode is Lee Bryant. Lee is a strategist, an organizational designer and developer, and the co-founder of PostShift. Lee is widely recognized for his pioneering work, at the intersection between technology, networks, and organizations. And we know each other for now several years, more than a decade. I used to invite Lee at the conferences we used to organize. So Lee, it's a great opportunity to have you on the podcast.
My pleasure. Really great to see you both and looking forward to a conversation.
Lee, at PostShift and in general in your career, you have been helping organizations to move beyond industrial age hierarchies towards more adaptive networked, digitally enabled models. You have a very long experience now. And in the last few months, we have been following your work in how you try to integrate through your writings, and I guess also the work you do with customers like we do, this crazy important technology like generative AI. So I think we would like to start giving you a space to tell us a little bit more of what's been your experience based on your multi-decade long work experience as an organizational developer at the edge, let's say, of the space. So what are your learnings and how are you now looking into the opportunities and the challenges that are opening up in front of us as we rethink organizations for this age of AI and beyond?
I mean, I think the probably useful context is that the way I came to this is, a little bit different. So although I've been playing with computers, since the age of 10, which is a very long time ago at this point, and programming and so on, actually I was involved in politics. My first career was in politics and diplomacy. One of the things that really fascinated me there was the different organizational templates from bureaucratic international organizations to very hierarchical government organizations to what we're seeing today in Ukraine, actually, which is a more distributed, networked, agile approach to sort of empowerment and self-representation in the face of big, powerful bureaucratic forces on the other side. So I was doing this work. It was crazy work. It was very intense. And I came across the internet, in about 1994, I think, when I was doing this work. And I started using that to distribute sort of blog-like information to all of our journalists, politicians around the world who were involved in supporting what we were doing. And it was immediately clear that this was a game changer in terms of giving people the power of self-representation. So our information didn't need to go through the prism or the filter of, the BBC or, somebody that would try and sort of, in a way, compress the information to an acceptable form. We could actually speak to people direct, and we could build networks of common purpose and get things done. And we really got things done. We got things done with very few resources that were defeating more sort of powerful opponents in a sense. And so when I sort of stopped that work, initially myself and Livia, my business partner, we were interested in working with developmental organizations, with charities and so on. And instead of them being sort of basically direct marketing companies, that do some good work, we wanted them to actually connect directly with people, capture that purpose, that energy, and do things in a more authentic way. Quietly, we drifted into the world of business because we also realized that there was a sort of humanitarian question in all of these sort of battery chickens sitting at their cubicles, having rather sad lives, and then going home and having a gin and tonic and a cry at the end of an awful work day. So we became very interested in actually how we could improve the experience of work. One thing I recognized was that from a historical perspective, the late 20th century, or really actually the late 19th century sort of factory model really sort of came out of feudalism in a sense. This idea that there are lords and peasants, there are sort of managers and workers, there are different classes of individual, and the role of the manager was to recruit all of these workers, extract value from them, and make profits and so on. And it just occurred to me that, with technology and also with the rise of, education and the fact that we're not just factory workers anymore, right? We're knowledge workers to a large extent. We could do a lot better than this. And so from the late 1990s onwards, we started building sort of web-based collaboration systems, knowledge sharing platforms, ways of bringing networks and connection to the work of organizations. And we were quite successful in doing that. I think we were quite early in doing that. And then we saw the rise of the first blogs, and we realized that that was another game changer. This was a almost free, in monetary terms, form of networking and communication that was, largely open source. And it did the things that we were doing for lots of money. It did it really easily and really simple. So we switched, we created a new company called Headshift, and we were really focused on injecting social technology into the enterprise as a way of humanizing the enterprise, but also as a way of reducing its cost base, making it more effective, and sort of in a way taking back a little bit of power from this amorphous sort of class of generic managers, who seem to hold all of the control and all of the power, but in fact were not technology aware, and therefore were not actually doing a great job in terms of the transition to the internet age and so on and so forth. So that's really where we began. We had a great time with Headshift. The company was acquired by a bigger US group. And then we sort of sat and reflected and thought, well, what we've done is we've used technology as a kind of Trojan horse to create these outcomes that we were looking for in terms of more human connection, more agile working, etc. But where are the templates? Where are the organizational models, right, that can be like operating systems in the internet age? And we did some reading, we looked around. There wasn't a great deal. There were some very old, excellent books from cybernetics in the early part of the 20th century to Peter Senge, all these sort of things. But actually, the only way that the most visionary organizations were able to make this work was if they had a visionary CEO. So all of the case studies, whether it's Morningstar, Favi, all these sorts of things, they really relied upon one extraordinary individual giving power or sharing power. And we thought, well, that's an edge case. How can we make this more popular? How can we make this easier to achieve? And so we became interested in organizational transformation, templates, models, and so on. And then we did a lot of work with some very big companies, sort of helping them with that transition. I think the way they understood it to a large extent was about agility, but actually our goals were a lot wider than agility. They were about sort of human purpose, about being technology-led, as well as just being more flexible and adaptive. And I think what was interesting was we felt we had a very good handle on how to do digital transformation at a fairly large scale. But what we'd really underestimated was the inertia and the resistance of management as a group within these companies, taking a often quite short-termist attitude, thinking about themselves rather than thinking about necessarily the future of the organization. So that was our blocker to having greater impact in that area. And then one of the concepts that I know we all share is this notion of the platform organization as a sort of starting point, as a basic template. And what I like about the platform organization is that we get machines to do the machine stuff so that people can be free to do the stuff that they are good at. Whereas in the old model, we treated people as fungible, resource workers, right? They're just following a process. They're not really having much input. They're not using their brains or their creativity. So we built a machine out of sort of human meat. And what I want to see is us using technology to build a machine upon which humans can be human, connected, express themselves, and do the brilliant work that we all know they're capable of. So that's what I like about the platform concept, is that separation between the service layer, the automation underneath, and the free-form, agile, connected sort of lateral networks of people on top. And when we were towards the end of our period with Headshift and Datcher's group, a friend of mine, Dave Gray, who was a colleague, we were working together. He wrote this book, about the platform organization, which I found really, really interesting. Very simple book, but it was a really excellent observation. And so that became something we sort of championed, I guess, from that point forward. But where AI comes into the picture is that things that we were trying to get companies to do manually, which is map your processes, map your service layer, map your capabilities, try and automate the services underneath so that you can be less bureaucratic on top. All of that suddenly became a lot more achievable because, the whole idea of agentic AI is that we can build little, very simple sort of bots or software, workers that can sort of own a service, oversee it, improve it, connect it with other services. And then we can actually achieve that sort of service platform layer much more easily than we could in the past, where it relied on lots and lots of change work, lots of transformation work, lots of consulting, lots of technical development and so on. So for me, I'm sort of at the moment in two minds. On the one hand, I can see the incredible potential of agentic AI to create the platform organization and therefore to really become a sort of an organizational operating system that others can adapt and they can use for themselves. That's my optimistic side. My less optimistic side says, you know what, maybe companies are like nurseries or high school. They're fundamentally a social competition structure. They're not really about value. They're not really about work. They're about people feeling good about themselves. And that's why they're dominated by this class of managers, in which case I'm just going to give it up and go home and do some gardening. So I guess that's where I find myself at this point.
You explicitly saying that agentic technologies, which it's also important to underline that you're not talking about generative AI in general, but we're talking about agents, right? And you speak a lot about agents ops on your newsletter. You speak about agent human interaction. So I think that's a nuance that is worth to maybe deep dive into. But I'm curious to hear most practically how you see agents as a technology that can extend the concept of the platform organization that you have introduced. Because I've loved that you introduced this idea of a platform organization as the place where machines can do machine work and humans can do human work, which is very resonant with our framing understanding of the platform organization being an entrepreneurial space, right? So really enabling with the people to do the work. So I'm curious to hear, first of all, how do you see agents, which are quite a radically new technology, enter this space? Because they are a bit of a mix between machine and people, to some extent, if we look into them from a naive perspective. So what do you think about that?
There's a lot of really interesting things about AI, and the idea of the programmable organization is one that I will probably talk about a little bit more in this conversation, because I think it's a fascinating idea. But if you look at the evolution of technology, I think there are lots of lessons in the evolution of the software industry that organizations can learn from and probably will replicate over a period of time. One of those is the idea of microservices versus monoliths, So in technology, we used to build these big single platforms where everything is very closely coupled together. And then if there was a problem or strategy changed or you need something new, it's actually quite hard to adapt a monolith. And so microservice architecture became a very popular thing, I don't know when, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't know. And the idea is that you try and build the smallest possible unit that can actually run a service. So think about being a finance company. Think about being a law firm or an accounting firm. You have a bunch of calculators, something that calculates utilization, for example. Now, in reality, in an accounting firm, there are probably 25 versions of this. They're all in spreadsheets and they live on someone's PC, right? What you need is one service, which is a utilization service where you plug in some data via an API and it will send you back a calculation. And if you need that utilization calculator along with 10 or 15 other calculators to build something bigger, you just send calls to the different services and you get back what you need. So it's an issue of composability. The idea that we want building blocks on which we can innovate and build new things easily without having to build everything from the ground up as we used to do. So if you have in mind the idea of microservice architectures, I think this is the link with agentic AI. An LLM is a model. They're very powerful. People claim they're going towards some kind of general human intelligence, which I actually don't believe. But if you take a small language model, something that's trained on accounting information or trained on legal information, then it's a lot more reliable, it's a lot smaller, it's a lot simpler. And you can create an agent and you tell the agent, your job is to run the utilization calculator. So I want you to be in charge of it. I want you to think about improving it. I want you to spot bugs in it. And I want you to make sure it's 5 nines available to the rest of the platform when they want to use it. And all the agent does is it owns that service and it sort of is, in effect, that service. Now, that's a simple one. You can also have agentic capabilities which are multi-agent. You might have one agent that's an orchestrator, one agent that's a planner, and then you have a series of specialized agents that do things that they are trained on and that they're good at, basically. So if we go back to the platform organization, one of the techniques that we've used very heavily in organizational transformation is capability mapping. We look at an organization's strategy. We say, what does the future look like? What do you need to do? What are the gaps in your capabilities? And typically maybe they've outsourced some stuff that they really shouldn't have outsourced because it's now a core competence, or they buy in stuff. We say, well, look, you need to own your core capabilities. You need to unpack them and understand what processes, what skills, what elements or components make up those capabilities. And then you have a working sort of, in a way, process map of the organization if you put that together. But the beauty of agentic AI is you don't need to do that manually. You can have agents that actually sort of represent these capabilities and make them available to other agents, to other systems, and of course, available to people as well. So that's the way I see the advance of the platform organization, is that we effectively build an agentic sort of layer that does all of the boring process work that people are currently employed to do. Now, then some people say, well, what about jobs? And then the answer to that is, well, really? Do we want our ability to eat to be predicated on a 9-to-5 job in a cubicle that involves 2 hours of train travel in a city like Rome or London or something like that? No, I think the whole world and the whole economy is changing, and we will not be solely reliant on these jobs in order to eat and survive. And anyway, these jobs don't pay enough to buy a house, right? Or even to buy an apartment in many modern economies. So that model is anyway breaking. And so I'd rather see a world where we use agents to free people up and do better work. Maybe there are fewer people, but they have a much more rewarding and purposeful job. And then other people can focus on their side hustles or their drop shipping or their entrepreneurial activities to try and support themselves. Yeah, so I'm quite positive about agentic AI. I'm a lot less positive about the impact of generative AI in the consumer space, but I guess that's a different question altogether.
What I understand from what you say is that you see agents becoming the parallel to our microservices in the age of microservices. We can call it micro capability providers. So you increasingly look at the organization as a set of capabilities, which is essentially running a process or processing certain information to certain outcomes, especially knowledge related context, or using a certain infrastructure in a much more heavily dependent context, say, on machinery or things like that. But essentially, there is a capability that the organization has that can be programmed because it's a replicable type of job, or it's a reasonably clear standard procedure that you can put in the hands of an agent. So you can have this capability suddenly be able to run 24/7, servicing everybody or supporting anybody that needs it. So looking at the organization first as a set of modular composable capability, the reflection rather that I have is what happens if we look at the organization as a set of capabilities from two perspectives? First of all, it makes me think that the human contribution is going to be increasingly about how do you compose. So it's rather stopping being about doing the work, but rather choosing what work and how to compose it together to generate new outcomes. So it's much more about composing. And when we look at our contribution as humans in organizations as a composition, instruction providers, and so on, it really becomes hard for me to think about organization in the same way. So especially from a perspective of the boundary of the organization, because first of all, I think that when I need a Lego brick in the composition I'm building, why just using the ones that I have in my box? I should maybe look into generally what's available on the market on other boxes, so it's beyond my organization. So suddenly the work is no more about the organization, but rather it is about how do you compose across organizations. And secondly, what happens when the composer is also an agent? So how do you see that dynamic really upholding the concept of an employee and the concept of an organization?
It's interesting because I don't really like the concept of the employee. I like the concept of people very much, but I don't like the idea of a role and a title which absolutely has baked into it a kind of inequality, right? Or boundaries on what they can achieve and what they can do. Several things. I'm going to mention a few things that come to mind there, perhaps without structure. One is that the majority of the most powerful innovation these days is combinatorial innovation. It's precisely combining, remixing, composing. That's what's cool. You can look at the Gutenberg press, you can look at the internal combustion engine at the end of the 19th century, and you can look at the iPhone. In each case, the basic components existed, but it was put together to deliver a new customer experience or a new user experience with immense imagination and design talent. And all of them changed the world, right? All three of those inventions completely changed the world. So I'm a big believer in combinatorial innovation, but to do combinatorial innovation, you need the building blocks and you need the freedom and the time and the permission, if you like, to think about those things. So in the platform organization, I've always imagined that there are lots of people who are, to take the sort of higher or the Rendan-Hay sort of approach, they're very zero distance to the customer. They're basically located with users or customers, and they are really focused on those needs. And then what they do is they pull from the platform components, agents, capabilities to actually create something entirely new and bespoke that meets a particular customer need. I think that's a noble activity. I think it's a great way of seeing the role of people in helping customers, solving problems in the world, creating things that people use. And the stuff at the center, the admin stuff, is sort of in a way less value creative. It's less important. So that's the first thing to say. So yeah, there may be fewer sort of employee drones just clicking buttons and filling in spreadsheets, but there will be lawyers, there will be accountants, there will be designers, there will be composers of all of this beauty and all of this wonder. And so I think that's still a very positive vision. And I think it actually does relate to the studies that you've done on Rendon-Hay as a model. It's a great model, right? It's got lots of natural components to it. It's got lots of dynamics that seem to work very well. And so I think it makes that vision, as well as just a general platform organization vision, a lot more achievable. So I'm quite into that. But I want to make another point, actually, which it may be a bit vague and philosophical, but is about how we build on things. If you look at human language, if it began as a series of sort of sounds and noises, it was then about accounting. Largely, it was people complaining about not having 10 bushels of corn when they paid for 12 bushels of corn or whatever. And what's happened is, you then abstract the language further and further until you get to things like poetry. And a poem is a bit like a zip file, right? It's a form of compression. In 100 words, you can evoke 1,000 words, because we all know what the words mean. They refer to existing knowledge or cognitive services in our mind. And so it's a beautiful way of building on the shoulders of giants. And this is also what software has done. Software started when I was programming, it was machine language, it was BASIC, then it was all of these low-level languages. Then we had frameworks like Ruby on Rails, and now you just type in NPM or whatever into a command line and it will build you an entire infrastructure. But it's still a technical domain. And now we've gone the extra step where we can do all of that using natural human language. And so in a way, we're moving up the abstraction layers, we're moving up the value chain, and we're creating the ability to do incredible things with small instructions, because you've got all of these layers below you. If you imagine what a team of 10 people can do, if they are able to instruct their big orchestrator agents, using natural language and using their own culture, their own values, their own strategic goals, and then below them can unfold this complex detail of how that stuff happens, how the app gets built or how the business unit gets built or how they do their marketing, all of that stuff. These are sort of superpowers. We need to make sure we use them well. And that's why I'm also interested in sort of enterprise AI. It may sound boring compared to the wider world of the internet, but in organizations, people have common purpose, they have mutual responsibilities, they have contracts. That's a very higher concept, the idea of mutual accountability through contracts and so on. And so organizations have this ability to write their own constitutions, their own code, their own rules, their own cultural norms and values in a way that can be good and it can be bad, but at least it's not the open wilds of the internet where consumer AI will be used to trick people, scam people, overturn governments, create populist movements, all of this negative stuff that we've seen with the rise of social media. So this is the other bit I'm actually exploring right now, is the beauty of rules and the beauty of actually making the implicit explicit, right? Because if you make your norms and your rules explicit, which by the way, you need to do for agents to be able to operate because they don't assume anything, then actually you also create a more equitable environment of work. This is the one positives that Max Weber, said about bureaucracy was, in fact, people know where they stand, right? There are some rules that are supposed to be enforced, and actually you can rely on them rather than the powerful whims of the leaders, or the warlords or whatever we're talking about at different times in history. So I'm really interested about this intersection between language as programming, the explicit nature of rules and norms, and then what we can do with all of that in order to make work easier and to do more value creation rather than sort of performative workplace theater, turning up to meetings, communicating in PowerPoints, and just trying to work out who's more powerful than who. Because none of that, it's all socially interesting, but it's not interesting in terms of value creation.
Few things that stood out. First, I wanted to tell right from the beginning what you spoke about, power of, let's say, self-representation, network of common purpose, and sort of bringing in humanitarian side to the organization, right? So that was on one side. And then there is the other side of using technology or AI in this case for sort of very technical work, let's say finance, tax models, or any microservice sort of architectures, right? So where do we balance the two? I think that's something I wanted to touch upon, that whether to look at AI from simply like an automation point of view, which I know a lot of leaders do. So do we stop there, or do we change that language to AI then augmenting human capability, redesigning, organizational workflows, structure, decision making, team dynamics, things like that. So how do we sort of do the two and balance both of them? I think that's something I'm curious in a very practical sense in terms of application at an organizational level.
And that balance is going to be something that I think we all explore, and that we will make some mistakes and we'll go down some blind alleys along the way. But I think, first of all, we shouldn't be afraid of automation of soulless, boring, repetitive tasks. I don't think anyone should really be afraid of that. So the two things are happening in parallel in a sense. I think there is work going on. We've had RPA and other forms of automation for years in organizations. But I think now what we have is smart automation, where you don't just automate a service, but the service has some intelligence and self-awareness and goal-seeking behaviors, because that's intelligence devoid of goal-seeking is not intelligence. It's just, pretend, right? So smart automation will continue. It's a really important thing. It's not hard to do. It's a lot easier to do now. But the augmentation is the really interesting bit. And I think the problem in the middle is how we've defined work. Because work is all about jobs, roles, and processes to a large extent, it's fundamentally dehumanizing from the beginning. And so if we want to augment the human, we need to sort of, in a way, unlearn some of that mental model, right? We need to just say, look, this is our purpose. This is our strategy. This is what we're trying to achieve. Go for it. Here are the rules. Here are the guidelines. Here's roughly how we operate, but, go for it. And I think what we will see is everybody being a manager, because everybody will manage agents. They may manage people as well, and there is some value in that for good managers, for sure. But I think people will have a more empowered relationship with their tools compared to the first sort of two waves of enterprise technology, which were all about big platforms that IT spend, 5 million euros building, and it takes 3 years and it's a load of rubbish, but we have to use it anyway because that's what we've got, right? That's one of the empowering ideas that we're going to see here, is more human control over the technology, because things are, programmable. And I think that in itself changes the power dynamics, it changes the social dynamics, and therefore it has more potential to augment human work. But when we say augment human work, it's a bit like the field of HR. You can't empower people in the sense that you can't do it to them. So I can't, as an enlightened manager, augment somebody. They need to be fundamentally empowered in the first place to use whatever they can get their hands on in order to elevate themselves and elevate their own work and their own creativity. So the language is always going to be complicated, but I don't think there's a contradiction in the two. I think we'll see, a lot of basic, boring work essentially eliminated through automation. And by the way, that includes probably 30, 40, 50% of middle management as well. Because actually, if you write down an algorithm about what they do, it's like, look at sales numbers. If number too low, have a meeting, shout at someone. Agents can do that pretty easily. So we're going to see that level of replacement of tasks for sure. But as you hinted at, where it gets really interesting is where we're going up the stack a little bit, and people are learning how to use these capabilities to do things that we can't even imagine, or things that would have taken a whole department in the past in order to fulfill. So I see them both working hand in hand. I think we're going to have a lot of tensions. There's going to be a lot of misuse of some of these ideas, but I think the potential is there, and it's really going to come down to natural competitive dynamics, where certain new companies, certain transformed old companies actually demonstrate success with this. And then I think it becomes a lot more mainstream at that point.
Even for me, like the language we use in organizations, just from a structural point of view, right? Like it's such a, unfortunately, sort of command and control reporting lines, like your everyday language, just how you speak in organizations is sort of outdated still. So when you put tech on top of that, which is so dynamic, it becomes harder to sort of adapt. So I'm curious how that works.
This has been the problem, right? Because
Yeah.
every wave of technology has been wrapped around the existing corporate hierarchy. IBM got started really doing sort of calculations on missile systems and so on, and then the mainframes, and then the sort of middle tier, and then the PCs, and then the internet. And every stage has been wrapped around the old hierarchical structure, and that's been the problem, right? And that's still a risk with AI today. We could just automate away some lower level jobs, but still have this sort of absurd sort of, Heath Robinson contraption of a hierarchy on top that believes it's doing work. So that's the key thing, is we need to reimagine and rethink from first principles. What is work? Why are we here? What are we doing? What's the goal? And then try and apply it in a more rational way, I think.
Somehow we are transitioning in a world where we're going to see much less friction in terms of capital, for example, right? We see a lot more leverage. You spoke about agents and everybody becoming a manager. And you said that this situation caters to an organizational context where rather than managing people, you set their rules and you try to convince them basically to do things in your system, right? So as organizational developers nowadays, the challenge we have is more like, okay, how can I create a system where people want to come and create? Because there's so much potential outside that why someone should actually join an organization, which is more or less reconnecting with the idea of composability, of infinite composability, is inherently challenging to the very idea of what an organization is and what is not. Because to be honest, at the end of the day, if we look at the theory of the firm, that was premised on transaction costs, right? Once this transaction cost and leverage goes haywire, how do you rethink the organization? So I don't want to make this conversation so fuzzy and theoretical, but maybe if you can put it in, maybe you can help me to put it into a more practical perspective for leaders. But looks like we are due for a deep rewiring of the organization, right? What really is an organization? So how does it look like in your point of view, and what are the practical or essential ideas that organizational leaders may consider to be pioneers in this space rather than followers?
The first thing I would say is that although, back to one of your points, the external boundaries of the organization may become permeable, so they're less like boxes and they're more like, this is our center, but actually we bleed out, we stretch out beyond the formal boundaries of the organization. At the heart of that is the organization's platform, right? It's in a sense, the machine, and also the core people who put in place its values, its value chain, and its sort of view of the world. And I think if you are a successful organization and you build a platform, to borrow a phrase from Tim O'Reilly, you create more value than you consume, then you can invite other people, other companies to use that platform as well, right? This is, the sort of Amazon platform model. It's a model that's incredibly successful. You build more than you need. You have, let's say, an e-commerce engine, a marketing engine. You've got all of these different pieces, but you've got little companies like the birds that clean the teeth of the crocodile who are working at a level of revenue that you're not interested in, but in fact, they could rent space on your platform, or they could use your platform in a different way that's not core to what you do. And therefore, you would increase the influence of your platform. You would become more central in the market as a player, but you still get to focus on what you want to do. So I think the focus on understanding your capability needs, mapping them, and focusing a non-stop sort of permanent process on capability development, for example, in the direction of agentic AI, but not only in that direction. There are other non-AI technologies that are still incredibly relevant. I think that's the route to strategic advantage in any kind of knowledge-based work or any customer-facing work. Now, it's a bit different for pharmaceuticals, for manufacturing, for Siemens making gas turbines at vast scale and so on. But the principles still apply. Rather than think about a web of manual processes that needs to be held together by enforcement of management, think about building the machine that creates the machines, if you like, and focus on that platform development so that you can then allow all of the talent in your organization to come to the table, really, and to apply itself to what we can do with these capabilities and what we can do with that kind of platform. So this is where I'm quite optimistic, I suppose, because I do think that, there's so much investment and attention being applied to agentic AI that it will become actually a subsidized technology, right? A bit like Ubers. Where I live, Ubers are super cheap, and pretty much Uber's been paying you, every ride because they're going for that classic scale play. And I think it's a bit like with agentic AI. We're going to have access to a ton of really, really useful tech that billions of excess capital, has been put into creating. And that gives us a chance to build out these sort of engines, these value creation engines and these platforms at the heart of an organization. And then we're free to organize using whatever socio-political, socio-technocratic model we want, right? Because we've solved the problem of hierarchy in a sense. If you look at hierarchy having three purposes in an organization, one is status signaling, which it's natural at. Dogs do it, humans do it, even cats do it. Then you've got hierarchy as a communication network, which it's terrible at. It's just about the worst way to communicate. And then you've got hierarchy as a way of holding together these manual processes. Well, the third one we don't need. The second one we've already moved beyond, and we have enough social technology in the organization to communicate effectively. Yeah, sure, people can wear badges and different colored clothes if they want to feel important. Who cares, right? What matters is that we actually do the work. That's where I think agentic AI coming together with the platform philosophy is just the most hopeful moment, I think, in the last 20, 25 years of digital transformation to actually create real 21st century organizational operating systems.
You mentioned essentially to get people to invest, contribute, and participate to a particular organization. What's going to make a difference is your platform, right? How great your platform or side of the organization is, how much are you enabling, or how do you make them, the employees or the participants to your organization able to create value. Of course, you also made this connection with the value chain and in general the concept of value. If you think about an organization and you talk to leaders, and what does it really mean to make a difference on the platform side of the organization in terms of enabling services, and what is the role of value in that? So is there a dual system where maybe what you need to make clear is what values the organization wants to achieve, and what kind of enabling systems makes available to the people for them to really seek and produce this maybe share the concept of value, also including some aspect of ownership of this value. So how do you close the circle to really make a difference today in building the organization?
I mean, on a very simple, practical level, one of the things that we do and that we recommend, leaders do is to, in a way, take a lesson from DevOps in the technology world. These unshaven people wearing old t-shirts in the basement, managers never really paid them a lot of attention, but actually they were among the most professional, organized people in the whole organization. Because if they had to do a task, 3 times, they would build a script to automate the task. And then they would build a script to manage their scripts. And then they would build a controller to maintain observability over that system. And that's how we went from having teams of sysadmins desperately trying to run networks to having small teams running vast scale networks because of automation, orchestration, and composability. Those are the skills that they developed out of necessity. So there are some lessons there, I think, for leaders. And if you see somebody running a process manually 3 times, ask them to design a magical system that runs it automatically. Because, most people understand the bit of the organization that they're in. They can tell you what capabilities they have. They can tell you what exception handling they need to get done to perform the work. They are your design partners, actually, for automating those services. And if you can give them some reassurance that, they're not immediately going to get fired, right? And that if they automate that stuff that's the bane of their life, they can then actually focus on creating real value on top. then I think we can engage people across the organization in a sort of distributed fashion to come up with a concept, lots and lots of little concepts really about the sort of agents and the service automation that could be part of the future platform. And then other simple stuff. Don't allow people to go off and buy individual technology platforms that are not integrated. Make sure people refer to this capability map and build something that's integrated and that speaks to the other systems. Marketing usually go off and buy their system, HR go and buy their system, finance buy their system. So these are some practical steps, I think, that can get us towards where we're going. But then I do quite a bit of leadership, executive education, and mindset changes are a key part of that. Leaders as architects of the workplace, not just bosses. Leaders as navigators of uncertainty, not just people that try and predict the future and then plan or Gantt chart their way towards meeting it. These are sort of new leadership skills, which in a way are also old leadership skills. They're quite traditional strengths of naturally good leaders, but we need to talk about them, we need to cultivate them, and we need to move away from the concept of, just sort of bureaucratic shuffling and monitoring. One of the lessons of open data is, you don't need enforcement if you put the data on platforms and on screens and on walls and everybody can see where things are going. If everybody can see where things are going, they tend to self-manage towards the right outcomes because we all know what we're supposed to be doing, right? You don't need quite so much enforcement as you would in a closed system. So I think there's some very practical steps that can be taken by leaders to get this ball, moving. But they really do need to engage with the technical detail, not to the level of AI, MCP, RAG systems, but just conceptually. They need to understand, how things work in the 21st century, even if they never touch a line of code. And they need to have that confidence. And so one of the things I do a lot is try and bridge that gap between the world of technology, the world of, let's say, collaboration and social organization, and the world of organizational design from a sort of straightforward commercial point of view. What's the value chain? What's the investment model? What's the ROI sort of forecast and horizon scan, etc. So I think we need to bring those three things together. And there are remarkably few people who can actually work with confidence across those three areas. And I think that's one of the problems. We've had the vertically divided organization for so long. We've had swim lanes. We've had over specialization for so long that building the laterally connected platform organization is quite literally a 90-degree shift. That's going to take some time to work through the system, I think. But there are lots of social factors that also feed into this. The pandemic changed the world of work. People realized that if they didn't go to work, the world wouldn't collapse. Work from home and remote working is something that is now, accepted as a normal way of working. And so many people, going back to your Ronald Coase, your sort of the argument about why you would work in a corporation, so many people are deciding they don't want to. And so, the attraction of these corporate roles is reducing all the time. People would rather be a digital nomad, go and live in Bali or Jakarta or, Lisbon or wherever we want to live. And so I think there's a number of other factors in the background quietly moving towards creating the conditions for that kind of change. And I think the other part of this as well is we're often critical of corporations, but actually corporations are generally quite good corporate citizens in some respects. If you look at Unilever and its social purpose, you look at the sort of internal rules and diversity initiatives of many large companies, we're in a weird position now where actually the companies themselves are in fact better custodians of 20th century democratic values than some of the governments who are challenging them. You see that obviously with Apple in the United States. And so in fact, we may be getting together in these organizations partly to create a little oasis, right? A little world building where we can have some values that we believe in, but also we have a commercial purpose where we all want to make money, at the same time. I play far too many video games, and the idea of world building is such a fascinating concept when it comes to organizational design, because the best games, Cyberpunk 2077, Borderlands 4 that just came out, they build a world that has sort of aesthetic, it has a vibe, it has some backstory, it has something that really attracts you. It's like a good movie would do the same, or a good long-term series would do the same on Netflix. And that kind of world building, I think, is a really powerful force for employee engagement and for getting people to join you and believe in you. The platform organization is not a purely technical concept, right? I mean, if you look at Rendell Hay, you look at the higher model, entrepreneurial ecosystems, mutual responsibility and accountability, freedom to innovate, all of this stuff. It's quite human at the same time. It's very competitive. And that's one of the things I like about it, because competition actually brings out the best in people. It's what makes us innovate, right? So it's not a comfortable, safe place for lazy people, but the potential is there for anyone who wants to create value and do something extraordinary. There's a lot of factors here and a lot of things for people to focus on. But going back to the leadership point, on the practical level, yes, we can do capability mapping and we can get people to sort of automate their own work to an extent. But on the big level, we need to do some world building. We need a direction, and we need a concept that can attract people in terms of a good place to work, a good place to invest in, and a good organization that you want to buy from and be connected with. And so that whole world building thing, I think, is also part of AI. And in fact, on a technical level, it's also part of AI, because the next phase of AI is world knowledge. It needs to understand the physical realities of the world around it if it's to do more than just knowledge work with data and words. And so we're seeing that with driverless cars. We're going to see that with industrial applications and so on. And again, it's all equally fascinating.
For me, this is super interesting because I love the idea of like a distributed designer almost inside and outside organizations. And yeah, the idea of world building, I think when you spoke about just sort of digital nomads as well, I've seen that it requires both an internal and external restructuring, you as an employee and then your employer as an employer essentially. But it sort of happened. So I think it's a matter of time. So towards the end of the podcast, Lee, we have a section called as the Breadcrumbs, where we ask our guests to share anything that inspires them, maybe podcasts, movies, music, or anything you do in your routine, maybe that, is different and somebody can learn from it.
It's difficult for me because I'm a terrible filter feeder. I'm like one of those big whales that just takes in a million plankton, and I read a lot of trash. I read everything actually, from geology to popular culture to video games and so on. So I'm not a classicist in terms of my book list or my book recommendations, but there are some people doing great work, I guess, at the frontier of both the business side of AI and the technical side of AI. So I'm a fan of Azim Azhar, Exponential View. I think he's doing something really great. I think Simon Willison is also doing something great on the technical side, also Nathan Lambert and people like that. So I think it's good to read that, even if you don't understand all of it, because it's just a way of getting into the topic. I think on the sort of socio-technical cybernetics layer, which is also fascinating, people like Henry Farrell and Dan Davis are sort of continually writing about engaging topics related to that. And then there's all kinds of other people. My friend Celine Schillinger is writing good stuff about engagement leadership. Zoe Scammon about strategy and AI. But in terms of books, I'm far too all over the place to, in a time of sort of increasing populism and the collapse of democracy, then Milan Kundera is a good read. For example, How to Live in That. Ivan Krastev, I like in the Financial Times, about sort of taking a sort of Central East European perspective on all the crazy stuff that's happening. And of course, being in Portugal, Fernando Pessoa and his Book of Disquiet, because he adopts multiple different fragmented identities to explore all of the dimensions of his soul and his personality. And that's something I think we're all experiencing right now, seeing the different sides of how we think and how we work as a person. But yeah, I have a lot of empathy for AIs. People criticize AIs as being next word predictors, but I read so much trash that I am just basically a next word predictor. I'm just regurgitating popular culture from the last 100 years in everything I do. So can't take any credit for my own ideas, but I love sharing the other ones.
Thank you so much, Lee. It was really an amazing conversation. I think I resonated a lot with most of the things you said. I can see how our research agendas are really crossing to some extent. Especially I want to double click the idea of organizational development as word building. I think this is a massively important point that you raised, because I think it really conveys the idea that you have to connect as an organizational developer and designer these days. You have to connect both sides, the two major elements of the organization, which is on one side the technical, the automation, the building and the composing and so on that you mentioned when you said let's look into what DevOps can tell us, for example, which I think it was a brilliant parallel. But at the same time, if I think about the people doing technical optimization, they typically work in a context where it's very clear to them what is the outcome they want to generate. So, for example, is application availability or performances and so on. So, if you don't design what we call the forcing function, so the constraints of the system, which actually translate your value system into what you want your organization to optimize for, it's really pointless to automate. So what are you automating for? You're automating yourself into a lack of strategy or a lack of value. So I think it's really clear that word building means both. It means creating the infrastructure, always improving the organization, but in a context where you dictate, you design, even collectively, you design the value system, right? You design what you want to generate, what are the outcomes that you want to create, and you translate it into the constraints you give to the organization. So I think that was a very important resonant point for me. So I hope you also somehow share this perspective, and you also liked the conversation and enjoyed the conversation with us.
Yeah, it was great. And the reason, I enjoyed it as well is because I'm a big fan of what you guys have been doing. There's real depth, to that research agenda, and I've benefited from it, and I enjoy following it. So let's both keep it up and stay in connection.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying that. It's always great to know that we have been helpful. So again, Shruti, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining today and for your questions as always.
Thank you, Lee. It was really nice connecting with you. Thanks, Simone.
Yeah, and great to meet you.
And our listeners can check the webpage, boundaries.io/resources/podcast, where you will find the latest episode with Lee, with all the fantastic mentions and references that he shared during the conversation, in the notes and the transcript. And of course, until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.